Well, hello, friends. This is Pastor Marcy, and we are with the Bode family. And for us, this would be in the morning, but the Bodes are actually, it's the evening for them. So good evening, Bode family. And so we have Josh, who has he came last summer to preach at the Delmar Reformed Church. But some of the rest of the family, we'd love to hear from you. So Josh, good to see you. And Erica, also good to see you. And who are these little ones that happen to be right in between you two? So can you introduce yourselves?
I'm Gabe, and I'm in 7th grade, and I like the food here.
Ooh, yes. Yeah, so I had asked, I was like, what is your favorite part about being in Oman? So Gabe, you like the food. What's your favorite food?
I like Indian curry kind of stuff.
Ooh, that sounds really good. Yeah, it's amazing. And in 7th grade too. Holy smokes. And now what about this lovely young woman?
I'm Ruby and I'm in 5th grade. And I like that I can be friends with people from all different cultures and countries from around the world.
Oh wow, that's so cool. Do you now in the school you're at, it's an American school, correct? But there's people from all over the world that go to it, or it's an English speaking school?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, cool. That's so awesome that you get to know and be friends with people from all over the world and who are different than you too. That's great. And now what about the last but not the least? What's your name?
My name is Alex and I'm in 1st grade. And my favorite part happened today when we got a taco juice box with a bunch of
Ooh, fun.
the bunny in it.
Oh, I love that.
I bought a box of chocolate crackers and apparently it had a stuffed animal bunny in it.
The simple joys, that's wonderful. Yeah. Well, it's good to see all of you. Thank you so much for taking time to meet and to hear more. Like, the church wants to hear more from those that we support. And so, during these COVID times when traveling isn't possible, it's so good to take time to Zoom and to check in with one another. So this is going to be a question that I think any of you could ask or any of you could answer. But the first one is just share with us your journey of getting to Oman. So I know that you all were living in upstate New York. You were in Woodstock. And so how did God lead you to being in Oman? And what were you doing before going to Oman?
Well, I was pastoring the Woodstock Reformed Church that had been doing, we were there for 10 years. Before that, I did clinical pastoral education right out of seminary at Albany Med. And that's actually before the kids. Erica and I attended Delmar for a couple of years. Yeah. And I was also the stated clerk of the Mid-Hudson classes down there. We're from Michigan originally, so upstate was where we had all our kids, and they're home. We're Erica and I are Michiganders originally, but the kids are only workers, Woodstockers. You want to talk about how we got here, though?
I think our stories would be said differently, Josh and I. But I would say for us, a couple of years before we had the opportunity to even make the decision to come here, we were doing Ritter and faith walking, which really helps you, I think, get in touch with your guiding principles and your values and how you want to be and who you want to be in life. And when this job possibility arose for Josh to be the pastor in the Protestant Church in Oman, I think at first my kind of autopilot response was like, no way, that's crazy. We have kids that are at the time, I think 2, maybe 3. Alex was, and he's 6 now. And so they were younger, and it just seemed like a crazy idea. And then I think the more we talked about it, we just really got in touch with who we wanted to be and how we wanted to raise our children in this world with a larger kind of worldview and experiences than we grew up with in West Michigan. And so I think it just started to flow from there. I don't know what else you would say, but
yeah, no, that's, I mean, how cool to really like get connected to your guiding principles and what, like, how you want to show up in the world. And that kind of led you into this opening of being in Oman and getting connected there. Yeah, absolutely. And so now the kids, they were in, you were New Yorkers. That's what you would say you were, and I'm pretty sure what Josh was just saying, that you had, you'd gone to Camp Fowler too.
Yeah.
Oh, love that place. So wonderful. Delmar has sent a lot of people to Camp Fowler. So that's a fun place to be. Absolutely.
that was definitely a grief of this COVID summer, right, guys? Not getting to go.
Yeah.
Probably the biggest sadness of not being able to come back to the States was not going to Fowler this summer.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. Absolutely. That good Adirondack air. So many of us, I'd say like maybe even like all of the people at the church have never been to Oman. So if you were to describe to someone what Oman is like, who's never been here, how would you describe it?
Hot.
It's hot. Like, what's the average temperature?
90.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah.
Today it felt pretty good outside, and it was 104.
Oh my gosh.
Because the humidity was so much less today.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Often people think of Oman as a desert kind of country, which it is.
Mm-hmm.
But we have the fortune and misfortune to live near the sea. And so we get a lot of humidity from that, but we also get to be in the ocean. So.
Oh my gosh.
The summers are brutally hot, like 120 is not hard and humid. But then the winters, it's like paradise, man. It's like 60s, 70s. So that's hot. That's what hot means, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it also kind of sounds like humid and the higher temperatures too, which is, sounds pretty brutal. But it looks like you all are adapting somewhat. I mean, you said that today was a nice day because it was 104.
We spent the summer in the house, not just because of COVID, but because you really can't do anything outside in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
So hot. What else would you guys say about Oman to people from New York?
I don't know.
It just feels normal to you, right?
Yeah.
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 For
Absolutely.
me, it's like this sensory experience. Like The heat of the sun feels different. It's stronger here. The smells here, like the curry that Gabe was talking about, or the frankincense burners that are always going in restaurants, malls, wherever. Visually, it's so different from Michigan or upstate New York, where we're used to so much green. There's mountains here, which are gorgeous, but there's not vegetation on them. They're brown, gray, and all the houses and buildings are generally white and squarish. And sound-wise, you're hearing all the different languages. You're hearing the prayer calls from the mosques that are scattered around. You're seeing people in styles of dress that we're not used to seeing. You know, sometimes the full abaya, sometimes, you know, a sari if they're from India, but always very modest dress. So even though it's 104, you're not going to see someone in shorts and a tank top here.
Sure.
So for me, it's a whole just sensory experience coming to Oman.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about you, Alex? Anything you want to share about what Oman is like? You can say no.
No. Well, I mean, we were kind of talking beforehand about the not celebrating Christian holidays. So like Christmas Day is a work day. And there's just kind of different celebrations, which is so interesting to think about. I mean, that would be definitely like a cultural shift for sure.
I would talk, I'm glad they talked about the geography and the weather. That's a big factor and experience here. And I would talk about as well the culture and the people. So Oman is at the end of the Arabian Peninsula. So, and it's got a long history of trading. So Omanis are Arabs, Africans, because the Omani trading system went all the way down to Tanzania for hundreds of years. Or there's also a third group that comes from southern Pakistan. So the Omanis themselves are sort of diverse, but it's a Muslim society. So it's an Islamic society. So culturally, those are big factors. It's been more oriented historically towards India, just across the ocean, than to the Arab states across the impenetrable desert. So it's been, it's an interesting place. It's kind of like the Switzerland of the Middle East, and right in the middle of everything. And the culture of the people here is incredibly peaceable and hospitable and kind, I would say. So it's very, yeah, that's how I would start to describe the cultural aspect here. And then the other thing is, like all the Gulf states, Oman for the last 50, I mean, not like all the states, but Oman for the last 50 years has been modernizing at a rate faster than any other country in the US, in the world. So, and to do that, like the other Gulf states, they've brought in a huge amount of laborers and workers from around the world, mainly South Asia. Whereas in like the UAE, something like almost 90% of the population are not Emiratis. In Oman, it's about 50-50. So a little under 50% of everybody here is not an Omani. They're here as a migrant worker. And that includes us and all the Christians. So when you start to talk about our mission in the church here, it's really a migrant working community of low-wage laborers and housemaids, all the way through a professional class, which is here working to help the country to develop. So that's a huge dynamic in these countries, where if you're here and you're not an Omani, you are here because you have a job. And then when your job is over, you go back to your country. You can't stay.
Yeah.
And that's the way it is in the Gulf countries, so Oman as well.
Yeah.
Big part of our life here.
So I would love to talk more about that migrant worker kind of, how there's different people groups that are coming in here. But something that you had mentioned before is that, people might hear, out in the US, they might hear the Middle East and they would assume not they wouldn't necessarily think peaceable or, this kind of generous kindness. And so I'd love to hear, how is that, the hospitality, it seems like, is something that has been striking. And I think that's kind of wonderful. So I don't know if there's any stories or anything that any of you have of how maybe some of these judgments that the US kind of projects onto the Middle East have been kind of weaned off based off of your experience.
Well, I would say the fact that Christians are free to worship here and live, and these kids and their friends from all over the world.
Bye, friends.
They're done with school, and so they're aching to go. They're itching to go play video games or get on a call with a friend or something. So
and they've been in front of a screen all day for school, so it's understandable to itch something else. So yeah.
Thank you. I mean, Oman is quite well known actually as a peace broker in the region. The U.S.-Iran deal of some years ago, for example, was negotiated under the auspices of the Omani government, peace brokering that thing. And it's just a long-standing cultural norm and conviction of the place that they're friends with everybody and enemies of nobody. So they have relationship with Iran, and China, and the U.S., and the U.K., and India, and the Saudis, and the UAE, and they trade with them all. They have open kind of relations with them all. So even on that kind of institutional level, that's the case. And Oman was forged as a country, as a nation, out of a tribal society. So they've spent a ton of energy forming an identity that's radically pluralistic as well. So they have a really highly developed innate skill set in reconciliation and bringing people together, and they're extremely creative in resolving differences while staying together. It's a really interesting skill that this little country of 2 million Omanis has in the middle of all these major powers that surround it. They're very proud of that too. They're very aware of this in their position. So it extends to everything.
And it kind of seems like, especially in this time in our world, having people who are reconciling, I think that's a good thing. Absolutely. That is something to be proud of. Absolutely. So, for both of you, what does a typical week look like what does it, being missionaries, like RCA missionaries, what does that typically look like? Or even if there isn't necessarily a typical week, what are some of the things that make up your time in Oman?
I'm laughing just because my question is pre or post COVID.
So yes, especially, the pandemic, I I'd be intrigued to hear more about how the pandemic has maybe shifted some of that work, maybe for the better, or maybe not necessarily for the better.
I'll let Josh mostly answer this because he's more the missionary than I am. Because my life seems on the surface very similar to before. You know, I grocery shop, I clean the house, I bring the kids to school. I participated in Bible study fellowship at church, which is different in that the people I'm with are from Africa and India and things like that. So that makes it different. Or, yeah. So my life feels fairly similar, just with some cultural differences thrown in there.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, you asked what's the question is, what does a typical week look like?
Which is so hard for a missionary, but to say that, or even just really anyone, especially during the pandemic, it seems like, you know, what does a typical week look like? It kind of changes very quickly, but.
I mean, in a way, for me, I would talk about work, obviously, because I feel like I need to describe a teensy bit what this church is.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. So there's 4 campuses in the country where Christians can gather to worship. 2 of them are in this country. All of them are governed by the church that I serve and the Catholics. But really the Protestant Church in Oman is the leading church. It's a church, but it's also like a classes. So we have our own membership. We worship 5 times every weekend. So it's a big church. But then we also quote unquote sponsor sort of like the classes of about 100 other churches that also meet in the same buildings that we manage. So there's an aspect of the work which is like a church, and there's an aspect of the work which is like being a bishop or a stated clerk of classes or some president of a classes or something. And my life is both of those things, pastoring and also a lot of, I became the lead pastor of the place a year and a half ago, which just mainly is a lot of governance stuff. And we have about maybe 40, just in our English language church, we have about maybe 40 nationalities at least. And maybe the sponsor congregations are divided by language mainly, and also like, are you Pentecostal, or are you Church of South India, or what's your worship style? So the church is hugely diverse. I mean, just crazy diverse and big. And so all the fundamental challenges come out of that, it seems to me. And the work comes out of the just the huge amount of worlds that everybody comes from. Even if you're Christian, like our council, which is 15 guys and a couple women, we have people on there from Malawi, Kenya, Nigeria, several states in India, Brazil, Egypt, Philippines, Indonesia, America, the UK. I might be missing some. So it's like trying to get a group like that to govern a church, and the government looks to us to govern all of Protestantism in the country on these campuses. It's the diversity issues in both profound beauty. I mean, I think that's the witness of this place is the full kind of global church on display
Mm.
is really amazing. I mean, I want to take everybody from America, our churches that are partnered with us, to worship on a Friday and when we're doing communion or something. It really will move you to tears.
Mm.
And it's like a crazy Wild West, constant conflict, constant misunderstanding. For me, the fundamental ministry is trust building.
Mm.
Basically, that's all I'm doing is
Mm.
being a trustworthy presence, being the RCA. The RCA is known here for having a dog in nobody's fight. And therefore, we are looked to by both the ministry and the government and the people in the church and the leaders in the church to be that neutral, mediating leader party.
Mm.
And so most of my work is normal church pastoring in a large institution, a lot of governance, and just constantly staying vigilant to the communication in its breakdowns. And so, I mean, the work is extremely hard and a huge amount of hours.
Yeah, sounds like it. Trust takes a long time to build. Yeah.
It takes a long time. There's been a serious level of conflict here for maybe a decade and a half in the church.
Yeah.
And it's massively impacted its ability to function.
Mhm.
And you don't just turn that ship around.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
I mean, you also were talking about the high importance of communication and just even hearing all those different places that people are coming from. I mean, it just sounds like the translating kind of like Pentecost moment. Everyone is speaking with different tongues, and it's just like, oh my gosh, like I can see how the communication would break down and how that's so important to be very vigilant about making sure that things are heard.
Yeah. And so the cultural diversity is big. And I've also come to learn that the other dynamic that's very, very, very important, and especially for a white guy from America,
Mm-hmm.
is class.
Mm.
That is power and the legacy of colonialism in the global church movement, in the global Protestant church. It's very, very, very much still in the room in every single meeting.
Really?
Every time you have a conversation, the power dynamic between the professional classes and the lower wage working classes, even from their own country. But then again, like most of those cultures are hierarchical, and church cultures that are not democratic, even by reform church standards, are pretty democratic. So that skill set is valuable as a reform church person.
Right.
But like I'm immediately put in a position at the top of the hierarchy, for example, but I don't believe in the hierarchy. so how do you exercise that authority in a non-domination way, in a non-humiliating way, is an incredibly important challenge for the way the RCA is postured here. And that's been a huge part of the learning and trust building, I would say. So it's not only cultural differences and religious tradition differences, although that's huge. It's also the status and power differences that come with class and privilege, even with people from the same countries. So like just learning about the 100 different cultures that exist in the 3 southern Indian states.
Yeah.
Has been like, I could write, we could spend 3 hours on that.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, I mean, it just sounds like it's dynamic, the work that's going on there. But it's also like, yeah. I mean, it just kind of sounds like you're being put into this position, in this hierarchical position, even though it's like it sounds like you're willing to kind of, you don't need to be in that place of power, but you're often put there. Kind of sounds.
I think a huge part of the work of the RCA right now in this mission station is to deconstruct that legacy of the colonial past.
Mm.
And I mean, the RCA started this church in a different age, and to update the model for the 21st century international church in this part of the world is probably the central task. And it's pretty uncharted territory, really. And then also realizing that the whole thing is set within this kind of Muslim society where we're all guest workers. And so our witness as a community actually is, because they all know we're Christians and we're being like, we're what? We're like in the middle of this society, and our witness to Christ is really how we function peaceably among ourselves and how we practice love of neighbor in our everyday vocations all throughout the week. And so the challenge is enormous, and it is also the witness itself. It's very, and that's not academic. Like that actually, it's extremely day-to-day, nitty-gritty stuff.
Yeah.
It's crazy, dude.
So I guess that kind of leads into like the next questions that I'd love to hear from both of you is, what has been encouraging about being in Oman? And then what's also been challenging? I mean, Josh, you've kind of mentioned some of the challenges, but I'm really curious for both of you, what's been challenging, what's been encouraging? This could be connected to the mission work that Josh was just talking about, or it could also just be like culturally, what have been some of the challenges, or maybe just going from New York to Oman and all of those nuances that can happen with moving a family across the world.
I think a couple things have been encouraging for me. One is that we arrived here not alone, but with several other missionary families already settled here through the RCA and one CRC family that are working at the Alamana Center. And so we landed here with a couple of families that have been here for years and were able to show us the ropes, and just to have people alongside you that kind of are living in your same world and understand what your life is like as a missionary. It's a huge encouragement to have that community here. And it's been encouraging for me to see that some of the reasons that we chose to come here for our kids and for ourselves, and expanding our minds and stretching ourselves and learning and seeing and experiencing things outside of the Midwest or Woodstock, which are the two places we know best. That's come to fruition, right? Seeing ourselves and our children grow and learn in tiny ways, even like, this is silly, but when we first came, so many folks from our church are from some part of India. And I had just such a hard time understanding them, Marcy, just their accents, even though they were speaking English. And so even to grow some of those kind of basic skills to then be able to encounter other people from other cultures and be less afraid. That's just one tiny example. So to see the things that we hoped would occur kind of coming to life is encouraging to me.
Absolutely. And it's like a humbling experience, I'm sure, just having to say, hey, can you say that again, or can you slow down what you're saying? I mean, it's even just like, that's to just kind of say, all right, that's it's a good lesson of humility, which can be encouraging. That can be good.
Do that stuff and not just pretend that you understand what people are saying. Which would be my normal response. Okay.
Oh yeah, okay.
We had a guy in one of our church services who showed up this year with his son, who's like a middle school kid from India. And he told me after worship, he's bringing his son to this service because his son can't understand Americans' English.
Oh,
so
yeah.
taking his son to this worship service so that he can learn to understand my accent.
Oh, that's awesome. Gosh, how does it feel to know that you are representing the American accent for one child?
I just say my R's and
Oh my gosh. What about for you, Josh? What's been encouraging?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's been a learning thing. The learning has been encouraging, probably like what Erica said, actually, sort of along the lines we expected, but so much more for me than I could have known. I've already spoken to you about some of the fundamental learnings, which are experiential learnings, not theoretical learning.
Mm.
I was thinking, for me, probably the biggest impact of being here so far on my own sense of humanity, being a human, has to do with, I realized that even though I believe this in the U.S., here I'm actually having to live through it. That is, as a white middle-aged guy, I've learned that apparently I wake up every day with the basic assumption that the world wants to hear what I have to say.
Hmm.
Like, it's interesting.
Hmm. Yeah.
Well, here, I'm just really decentered from that. So yes, I have a job to do, and I have some authority because of just the position. But if you understood how these cultures work, that doesn't mean you actually have power. so like, I have a seat at the table, but it's not the head of the table, and I can say anything I want, but they're going to do what they want.
Yeah.
So having to let go of the outcomes, and it's a very humbling experience, and it just calls out a really different way of being and approach to life's problems, and even leadership in a community that, while I may have believed in it before in some sense, just this context, I mean, just the fact that we're not citizens and we're all migrant, we're here as guests, even on that very level.
Yeah.
Our religious freedom here is a gift of His Majesty and the people of Oman. And so how do we live with that gift gratefully when, and how do we do that where we don't, it's not a right we can just have, it's a gift given by our neighbors who are predominantly not Christians, definitely all Muslims. I mean, even just on that level, like, you don't get to, I'm just not in charge. So for me, that learning has been like a visceral, kind of life-shaping kind of journey, even in a couple of years. I think it's really valuable, and I don't know how to other than a conversation like this where you're asked, where I'm sitting here, you hear me trying to articulate it, right? Like I don't even know the language exactly how to describe this experience, how to convey that back to my people, our people in the RCA in upstate New York, just about how like you guys, the world is, well, our place in the world is not, it's just much more complex than we know somehow, and importantly complex. If we choose to become aware of it, there's a universe of learning, in my view, learning the way of the cross, learning how to live without power. That seems to me fundamental to the gospel that's available to us, etc.
Etc. Indeed. No, that's very good. Yeah, I mean that's challenging though, to kind of take up your cross, to have that, not to be decentered. I think that was a phrase that you had used. That can be challenging. There's a learning to that, especially coming from a context that very much puts you at the head of the table. To now it's a bit different. Yeah.
Not being at home, like even in the States, it's kind of like you're at home. Here, you're in somebody else's house.
Yeah.
All the time, 24/7. You're not in your house, so just being a guest.
Yeah. Erica, is there anything, I heard you say that there was a couple of things that were encouraging for you, or anything challenging being in Oman?
Honestly, it sounds silly, but the weather is a huge challenge to me.
That's not silly. That's very real. That's
I love being outside and like hiking in the green mountains of the Catskills and all that. And so not being able to be outside much for half of the year is hard, but I pin all my hopes on what's coming in a month and a half maybe,
Yes.
which eventually we'll be getting to 70s and 80s instead of hundreds and humid. So really I find the weather to be the most challenging thing for me. I mean, our lives are so different. He's so deeply enmeshed in the church, and I'm with the family and in the children's school, which and a little bit in the church, but so he has a different life than me here.
But like with that, different challenges, different learnings, and I mean, but also things that encourage you. Those are so good, and people would love to hear that. Absolutely. Oh yeah, Josh, were you going to say something?
What Eric was mentioning is one of our, I would say, a challenge that we experience here, which is my life is very different than theirs. If we don't work at it all the time, connecting the two.
Yeah. It's good to be mindful of that, for sure. So because pandemic, COVID times, one of the questions that has emerged from the Delmar Reformed Church is, what are needs that are emerging from the church or from where you're at, that's from the pandemic or because of COVID? All of us, I'm sure, some of the needs are, longing for the way it once was, or longing for physical touch. But I'm just curious, like, how has Oman been impacted by the pandemic, and what are some of those needs that are coming up?
I mean, I'll speak about the kids and school a second, how that's impacted them. And actually myself, because I had just started working at their school in early March, and then the pandemic hit, and March 15th, everything shut down. So I was just kind of starting to enter into my new phase of life and using my education. We're all finally in school, and it was an exciting transition for me. And then the school shut down. At first, they just said a month, although we knew that it wasn't going to just be a month. So from March 15th until a couple weeks ago, the kids started online school, and they will be doing that until at least November 1st. And then November 1st, they'll probably do some sort of hybrid model. And the airports closed, I think, in April. And so they only had really special, really expensive flights out for people that wanted to get out of Oman. And so we ended up choosing to stay here this summer instead of coming home and visiting our supporting churches, which was really wonderful last summer in the way of connecting person to person with the people in the churches that are supporting us and getting to share our stories. So we missed that opportunity, and we missed seeing friends and family, and we missed experiencing the beautiful weather instead we learned 20-degree weather. So in that way, it's impacted us personally. And then I think I'll let you talk about more the Oman perspective of that.
Yeah, I mean, I would like folks in the States to be aware that, speaking of the bigger context here, Oman has some petroleum resources, but not anything like its neighbors. The other thing is, so 2020 has seen two enormous society-changing things happen. Number one, His Majesty Sultan Qaboos, who was the Sultan here for 50 years almost, and really the father of the nation, he died in January. So for the first time in most Omani's life, a new Sultan came to power, Sultan Haytham, who's done a great job. But that was an epochal change. I mean, just very, very, very profound change. And we've lived through that, and then the pandemic. And before the pandemic, Oman's economy was in an extremely fragile state. You can go Google this and look it up. But because even before the price of oil went down early this year, Oman was in trouble financially, big time economically. And so that was before the price of oil crash and before the pandemic. So consequently, I'll talk about our church family. Consequently, and with the airports closed, and with all of the folks in our community, all the migrant workers here being workers, the portion of the community that's at risk has just expanded dramatically. The anxiety among everybody is through the roof. People are losing their jobs. People haven't been paid in months. People have been paid at 30% of the previous wages. People are waiting to get out of the country, but they'll go back to a place that's also being hit by the pandemic, and they haven't had a job there in years, for example, or even maybe lived there in 15 years. So the economic shifts of 2020 are going to hit Oman like no other. Maybe Bahrain, actually, our other mission station, that country is maybe similar, but Oman is going through right now a once in a generation level economic shift. and no one knows what it's going to look like after this in the next year. And in the church, we are wondering what's going to be left. What's it going to look like when we can open the doors again? We don't know. I mean, it's going to be a dramatically different reality. And the RCA has been here for 130 years, and we've just been doing a ministry of presence through all these shifts. And this is just the most recent one, and we're here right now through it. So that's the challenges. The challenges are enormous. We developed an emergency food program for Christians in the wider community that, for example, and but I mean, who wants to? There's also all the dignity stuff of people suffering in silence and not telling their story as well, because it's embarrassing to a lot of people who are, anyway, that whole thing. So that to me is, in a nutshell, the big question right now.
Yeah.
So prayers for the Christian community here, but also our Omani neighbors who are going through a similar version of it themselves.
Which kind of leads really beautifully to that last question. How can the church be praying for anything, and specifically in Oman, but then also for the Bode family? How can we be praying for you? How can we be supporting you? How can we support this work? So I heard, the Christian community in Oman, but then also it sounds like the economic, structures of, we're seeing, that's the thing about a global pandemic. We're seeing this all over the world, but these ripple effects we're going to feel for quite some time. So absolutely continuing to pray for those things. How else can the Dalmar Reformed Church be praying for the Bodes, the Oman mission?
Probably in similar ways to all of you, just this COVID era, as I like to call it, is just mentally challenging. And so I guess for all of our spirits and just dealing with still pretty much not seeing people is hard.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would say, keep in your prayers the people here and around the world who have no safety net. The amount of suffering that is just beginning really is incomprehensible. And so specifically, as you think about the Oman mission, pray for the folks in the church who are without a safety net, and that's a big deal. I would say pray for the leadership of the church as they try to cope with and figure out what the next version of this community looks like. That's going to take a lot of courage to face that reality. I would ask for prayers for me for perseverance, particularly for a sense of clarity on what the RCA's point is in being here through this, to continue to develop a sense of what we're still doing here and what we'll do here in the next phase and how it can be part of that, if at all. And let me see what else I thought of. You had asked earlier. I mean, and let me just say, for me, I think for us, that the fact that, Marcy, you asked and you guys are doing this with your mission partners, and we're one of them, and we're having this conversation, that you took that initiative, and that you and the Del Mar congregation are interested in that, in being aware. The awareness is itself a palpable support. I mean, someone going, hey, can we connect and take an initiative and being in that kind of a partnership with us, and stimulating just this kind of sharing is, for me, I don't know about for you, but maybe for us, a huge gift, huge gift. So if awareness is a kind of prayer, please keep doing that.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's just a gift to see both of you and to see the whole family as well, and to know, and please know that we do pray and support both of you, and we as the church are trying to become more aware of how, I mean, Del Mar is so small, so important to make sure we make our world bigger. And so conversations like these help us and help us grow in not only our worldview, but also in our faith, I think. And so thank you so much, both of you, for taking the time today to just share a little bit about what's been going on in Oman, and peace be with each of you. Thank you.
Thank you.